The sun was shining brightly over the sprawling estate, where Jessica's grand wedding was about to take place. Everything looked perfect. Rows of white roses lined the aisle, golden chandeliers sparkled inside the reception hall, and a live orchestra played soothing music as the final touches were made. It was the wedding Jessica had always dreamed of, a celebration fit for someone who had everything. Jessica, the bride, stood in front of a large mirror in her dressing room. Her expensive lace gown hugged her figure perfectly, and the diamond tiara on her head sparkled like a crown. She smiled at her reflection, proud of how stunning she looked. "I can't wait to walk down the aisle," she said to her bridesmaids, who nodded in agreement, praising her beauty and style. Outside the dressing room, staff bustled around to make sure everything ran smoothly. Among them was Mrs. Eliza, a janitor in her late 50s. She wore a simple uniform, her hands rough from years of hard work. Mrs. Eliza moved quietly, sweeping the floor near the bridal suite, making sure everything stayed spotless. Jessica stepped outside her dressing room to check on the decorations. Her sharp eyes scanned the area, catching sight of Mrs. Eliza cleaning nearby. With a dismissive wave of her hand, Jessica frowned. "Can someone get her out of here? This is a wedding, not a charity event," she said loudly enough for Mrs. Eliza to hear. Mrs. Eliza paused, her grip tightening on the broom. She looked at Jessica for a moment but said nothing. She lowered her gaze and went back to her work, her expression calm but thoughtful. Jessica's bridesmaids giggled nervously, unsure of what to say. One of them whispered, "Maybe she's just trying to do her job, Jess." Jessica shrugged. "I don't care. People like her don't belong in places like this. They're supposed to stay out of sight." As the janitor moved to another area, a tall man with kind eyes entered the scene. It was Daniel, Jessica's fiancé. He looked dashing in his tailored suit, his warm smile lighting up the room. "Hey, everything okay?" he asked, noticing the tension in the air. Jessica turned to him, her expression softening. "Of course, darling. Just making sure everything's perfect for us," she replied sweetly. Daniel noticed Mrs. Eliza walking away and gave her a polite nod. "Thanks for all your hard work," he said kindly. Mrs. Eliza paused, nodded back with a small smile, and continued her cleaning. Jessica frowned. "Why do you always do that, Daniel? She's just a janitor." Daniel's smile faded slightly, but he didn't respond. Instead, he looked at Jessica with a thoughtful expression, as if weighing his words carefully. "Everyone has a role to play," he said simply. The moment passed quickly as Jessica turned her attention back to the wedding preparations. She didn't notice the look of quiet understanding that passed between Daniel and Mrs. Eliza, a look that hinted at something deeper, something she didn't yet know. As the clock ticked closer to the ceremony, everything seemed perfect on the surface. But behind the smiles and sparkling decorations, an unexpected truth was waiting to be revealed. A truth that would turn Jessica's perfect day upside down. As the wedding preparations continued, Mrs. Eliza quietly worked her way through the grand hall, dusting tables and wiping down mirrors. She moved with calm precision, her years of experience shining through as she made sure everything was spotless. She didn't seem to mind that she was surrounded by wealth and luxury. She had seen it all before. But despite her composed exterior, Mrs. Eliza was troubled. As she passed by the ornate decorations and the extravagant cake that towered at the center of the room, she couldn't help but think about the many years of hard work that had brought her here. She had always been a dedicated worker, doing everything she could to provide for her family. She had taken on many jobs, from cleaning to cooking, all while raising her son, Daniel. Daniel had always been her pride and joy. He was kind, humble, and determined to make a better life for himself. Mrs. Eliza remembered how hard he had worked through school, how he had taken on part-time jobs to help with the bills. She also remembered the sacrifices she had made to support his dreams, never asking for anything in return. As she continued to clean, Mrs. Eliza couldn't help but notice Jessica's behavior. The way she had dismissed her so casually earlier had left a sting. But what bothered Mrs. Eliza more was how oblivious Jessica seemed to the struggles of others. Jessica had grown up in a world of privilege, and it showed. She was beautiful, confident, and used to getting what she wanted. But to Mrs. Eliza, that didn't mean she had earned respect. Mrs. Eliza understood that Jessica was just a young woman, still learning the importance of kindness and humility. But she couldn't help but feel protective of Daniel, who had come so far from his humble beginnings. She hoped that Jessica would one day understand what truly mattered in life, and that she would see Daniel for the caring, hard-working man that he was. While Jessica continued to focus on her wedding day, Mrs. Eliza found herself lost in thoughts about her son. She thought about the long nights she had spent alone, working in the shadows so Daniel could have a better life. It hadn't been easy, but every sacrifice had been worth it. As Mrs. Eliza made her way to another part of the venue, she overheard a conversation between two guests. They were talking about Jessica, praising her beauty, and how perfect she seemed for Daniel. "She's got everything," one of them said. "She's the ideal bride." Mrs. Eliza's expression softened as she thought about the words. She didn't disagree with them. Jessica was beautiful and had everything many people could only dream of. But as the janitor continued her work, she quietly wondered if Jessica truly understood the value of love, hard work, and sacrifice. For Mrs. Eliza, it wasn't about looks or wealth. It was about the connections we make with people, the love we share, and the respect we give one another. She hoped that one day Jessica would realize that, and that she would truly appreciate Daniel for the amazing person he was. The wedding day was nearing its peak, and all eyes were on Jessica. But the quiet janitor, who had seen so much of life from the sidelines, was about to reveal something that would change everything. The wedding ceremony was a beautiful success. The guests sat in their seats, eagerly watching as Jessica walked down the aisle. Her white dress sparkled under the soft light, and her smile was as bright as the sun. Her father walked beside her, a proud smile on his face as he held her arm gently. The guests looked at her with admiration, whispering to each other about how stunning she looked. But amidst the crowd, there was one person who wasn't so caught up in the wedding's glamour. Mrs. Eliza. She stood quietly off to the side, still doing her job, making sure everything was clean and in order. She watched Jessica with a calm expression, though a small part of her felt a little sad. It wasn't that she was jealous or angry. It was more that she hoped Jessica would one day understand the deeper meaning of what it all meant. Daniel stood waiting at the altar, his face full of excitement as he gazed at his bride. He was handsome in his tailored suit, his eyes warm with love as Jessica reached him. The guests stood and applauded as they exchanged their vows, promising to love and care for each other forever. But even as they made these promises, Mrs. Eliza couldn't help but wonder, did Jessica truly understand what it meant to love someone? After the ceremony, it was time for the reception. The grand hall was filled with chatter and laughter as the guests enjoyed their drinks and appetizers. Waiters carried trays of delicate finger foods, and the orchestra played soft music in the background. Everything was perfect, just as Jessica had dreamed. A few speeches were made to honor the couple. First, Jessica's father stepped up to the microphone. His voice was proud and full of warmth as he spoke about his daughter. "I couldn't be more proud of Jessica today," he said, his eyes shining. "She's everything a father could ask for. Smart, beautiful, and kind." The crowd applauded as Jessica beamed with happiness. Then Daniel's best man, a longtime friend, stood up to give his speech. He joked about the many years of friendship and some funny memories of their childhood, making everyone laugh. He ended with a heartfelt toast to Daniel and Jessica, wishing them happiness and love. Daniel smiled, raising his glass to his friend. But then it was Mrs. Eliza's turn. She wasn't part of the official wedding party, but Daniel had asked her to come forward to say a few words. She stepped up to the microphone, her heart racing a little. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, but she felt that this moment was important. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice steady but warm. "I'm Daniel's mother, And I'm so proud of the man he's become." Her eyes searched the crowd, settling on her son's face. "He's worked hard for everything in his life. And while he may not come from wealth, he has a heart of gold." She paused, looking at Jessica. "I hope you both will remember that it's not what you have, but how you treat each other that matters most." There was a soft silence in the room as everyone took in her words. Jessica, sitting at the head table, gave a polite smile. But inside, she was beginning to feel something that she couldn't quite explain. Daniel smiled at Mrs. Eliza, touched by her words. But Jessica's smile faded slightly. She wasn't sure why, but something about Mrs. Eliza's speech seemed to hit her harder than she expected. It was as if, in those few words, a truth was being revealed, one that Jessica wasn't ready to face. The rest of the night continued, but Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The evening was beautiful, but her mind kept drifting back to Mrs. Eliza's words. There was more to this story than she realized, and she couldn't help but wonder what it all meant. The reception was in full swing. The guests were enjoying the music, chatting, and dancing, while waiters moved between them, offering drinks and hors d'oeuvres. Everything seemed perfect, and Jessica felt on top of the world. She smiled as she looked around at the expensive decorations, the delicious food, and the perfect celebration that was all for her. It was her big day after all. But then, a small problem arose. As Jessica mingled with a group of friends, she brushed against a table, knocking over a glass of red wine. The wine splashed across the front of her wedding gown, leaving a noticeable stain on the delicate fabric. Jessica gasped, her eyes widening in horror. Her perfect day was now marred. She felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. She had spent months planning every detail of this wedding, and now something so simple had gone wrong. She quickly excused herself from the group and rushed toward the bathroom to assess the damage. Inside, Jessica stared at the stain in the mirror. Her hand trembled as she touched the fabric, the red wine spreading even more. She was about to lose it. This dress was priceless, and there was no way she could let it ruin her day. Then she heard a soft knock at the door. Jessica turned, surprised to see Mrs. Eliza standing in the doorway. The older woman was still in her janitor uniform, holding a clean cloth in her hand. "I'm so sorry to bother you, Miss Jessica," Mrs. Eliza said in a quiet, respectful tone. "But I noticed the stain. I may be able to help clean it." Jessica's face tightened with frustration. She didn't want to deal with a janitor right now, especially not one who had already made her feel uncomfortable earlier. But the stain was too big to ignore, and she couldn't risk ruining the dress. "Well, fine," Jessica said, trying to hide the annoyance in her voice. "But make sure you don't mess it up any further." Mrs. Eliza nodded, not seeming bothered by Jessica's harsh words. She moved toward the dress, gently dabbing at the fabric with the cloth. Jessica stood still, watching closely. "You should be more careful," Jessica said coldly, unable to stop herself. "You're a janitor. Shouldn't you be cleaning up messes in the back and not bothering people like me?" Mrs. Eliza paused for a moment, her hand stilling on the dress. There was a long silence before she spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Everyone has their role to play, Miss Jessica. It's not always about what you do, but how you do it." Jessica blinked, confused by the words. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, her tone sharp. But Mrs. Eliza didn't answer right away. She continued cleaning the stain, taking her time. She knew that Jessica wouldn't understand right now, but she hoped that one day the young woman would. The room felt tense, as if the words hanging in the air were more important than the wedding itself. Jessica opened her mouth to say something more, but before she could, she felt Daniel's presence in the doorway. "Everything okay, Jessica?" he asked, concern in his eyes as he looked between his bride and his mother. Jessica quickly wiped her eyes, feeling embarrassed. "It's fine," she said, trying to sound casual. "Just a little accident with the wine." Daniel glanced at Mrs. Eliza and then back at Jessica. He gave a small, understanding nod. silently acknowledging the help his mother was providing. Jessica felt a little uncomfortable, but she didn't show it. As Mrs. Eliza finished cleaning the stain, she stepped back. "There, it's taken care of," she said quietly. Jessica didn't say much, her mind racing with thoughts. Why had Mrs. Eliza spoken to her like that? And why did she feel like something was shifting in the air? The tension was thick, and Jessica couldn't help but feel that this night was starting to unravel in ways she hadn't expected. As the reception continued, Jessica found herself distracted by the events that had unfolded in the past few hours. The stain on her wedding dress was still fresh in her mind, but there was something more troubling that she couldn't shake, a feeling that something was off. She tried to push it aside, focusing on her guests, but her mind kept wandering back to Mrs. Eliza's calm demeanor and the words she had spoken. "It's not always about what you do, but how you do it." What did that mean? Why had she said it? And why had Daniel looked at his mother so warmly when she had helped clean up the mess? Jessica's thoughts were interrupted when Daniel walked up to her with a small smile, his hand outstretched. "Can I have this dance?" he asked, his eyes filled with affection. Jessica smiled back, grateful for the distraction. "Of course," she replied, taking his hand. She wanted to focus on him, on their future together, but something about the day felt different now. As they took to the dance floor, surrounded by their guests, Jessica tried to enjoy the moment. But her eyes kept drifting toward Mrs. Eliza, who was quietly cleaning up in the corner of the room. She wasn't just any janitor, Jessica realized. There was something about her that seemed different. When the song ended, Daniel led Jessica to a quieter part of the room, away from the crowd. He smiled at her, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he had something important to say. "Jessica, there's something I need to tell you," Daniel began, his voice gentle but serious. Jessica raised an eyebrow, sensing that whatever he was about to say was going to be important. "What is it?" she asked, trying to sound casual, though her heart began to race. Daniel hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "You know Mrs. Eliza," he said slowly. "Well, she's not just the janitor here." Jessica frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "Of course, she's just the janitor. What else could she be?" Daniel took a deep breath. "She's my mother, Jessica." Jessica's eyes widened in disbelief. "What?" she whispered, staring at Daniel as if he had just said the most unbelievable thing. Daniel nodded, his gaze steady. "Yes, she's my mother. She raised me on her own after my father left. She worked hard, taking whatever jobs she could find to support me. That's why I've always respected her so much. She's the reason I am who I am today." The words felt like a punch to Jessica's gut. She stared at Daniel, trying to process what he had just said. Mrs. Eliza, his mother, the woman she had so casually mocked earlier, the janitor she had dismissed as nothing more than someone who cleaned up after the wedding. "I didn't want to tell you this today," Daniel continued, his voice soft, "but I couldn't let you keep treating her the way you have." Jessica felt a wave of guilt wash over her. Her heart sank as she thought back to the way she had treated Mrs. Eliza, how she had made those rude comments, how she had dismissed her without a second thought. Now, she understood that this woman was not just someone hired to clean. She was Daniel's mother, someone who had worked tirelessly to raise him and give him a better life. "I didn't mean to hurt her," Jessica whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. "I didn't know." Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression both loving and firm. "I know you didn't, but I hope you understand now. It's not about wealth or status, Jessica. It's about respect and kindness. People like my mother, they don't deserve to be treated like that." Jessica nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time, she understood what had really mattered in this room. And it wasn't the luxury of the wedding, or the designer dress, or the beautiful decorations. It was the love, the hard work, and the respect that had gone into creating a life together. Daniel's words hit Jessica deeply, and she realized that she had a lot to learn. Jessica sat quietly at the edge of the reception, her mind racing with the new information Daniel had just shared. Her wedding day, which had felt so perfect just hours ago, now seemed clouded with guilt. How could she have been so blind? How could she have dismissed Mrs. Eliza, the woman who had given so much of her life to raise Daniel, just because of her job and appearance? She looked across the room, her eyes landing on Mrs. Eliza, who was still quietly working in the corner. The older woman moved with the same calm grace she always did, as if the world around her didn't matter as much as the task at hand. Jessica couldn't help but feel a deep sense of shame. She had treated this kind woman like she was nothing, and now she understood just how wrong she had been. As Jessica sat there, lost in her thoughts, the room seemed to blur around her. It felt as though everything was happening at once and not at all. She closed her eyes, and memories of her childhood began to surface. She remembered the lavish family dinners, the expensive toys, and the summer vacations to tropical resorts. Her parents had always provided her with anything she wanted, and she had grown used to getting what she asked for without question. But in all that luxury, Jessica had never been taught the value of hard work. She had never truly understood the sacrifices it took to build a life from the ground up, like Mrs. Eliza had done for Daniel. Suddenly, Jessica thought of her own mother. She had always tried to give Jessica the best life, but it had never been about working hard to earn what they had. It was always about appearances, about keeping up with the neighbors and showing the world that they were successful. Her mother had always been obsessed with status and wealth, pushing Jessica to aim for perfection in every area of her life, but never teaching her the real lessons of life. Lessons like kindness, respect, and the value of people, not just their social status. Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes as she thought about her own upbringing. She had been so sheltered from the reality of the world, and now she realized how much she had taken for granted. She had been so focused on her wedding day, the dress, the venue, the guests, that she had missed the most important part, the people who had helped her get there. She had ignored the sacrifices of people like Mrs. Eliza, and that realization hurt her more than anything else. A soft voice pulled Jessica from her thoughts. "Are you okay, dear?" It was Mrs. Eliza, who had quietly approached and now stood beside her. Jessica wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she said softly, looking up at the older woman. "I didn't realize who you really were, and I treated you badly. I can't believe how wrong I was." Mrs. Eliza smiled gently, though there was a quiet sadness in her eyes. "You're not the first to make that mistake," she said, her voice steady and warm. "But you're the first to admit it. That shows me you're willing to learn, and that's what matters." Jessica stood up, feeling the weight of her apology. "I was rude to you. I shouldn't have treated you like that. I understand now what you've done for Daniel, and for all of us." Mrs. Eliza nodded, her smile never fading. "It's never too late to change, Jessica. We all make mistakes, but it's what we do afterward that counts." For the first time that day, Jessica felt a sense of peace wash over her. She wasn't perfect, and she knew she had a long way to go to be the person she wanted to be. But this was the first step. She had recognized her mistake, and now she was ready to make things right. As the evening continued, Jessica took a deep breath and joined Daniel on the dance floor. The music played softly in the background, and for the first time, she felt truly present. The wedding wasn't just a celebration of her and Daniel. It was a chance to start over, to learn and grow, and to make amends. She turned to Daniel, a soft smile on her face. "Thank you for helping me see the truth," she said quietly. Daniel squeezed her hand, his expression full of love. "I always believed you could understand, Jessica. I'm proud of you." And for the first time that evening, Jessica felt proud of herself too. The evening had taken an unexpected turn. Jessica's mind was no longer focused on the details of her perfect wedding, but on the people around her, the ones who had worked hard, who had built lives from scratch, who had sacrificed to make something meaningful. She had been blind to that reality for so long, And now it was all becoming clear. As the night wore on, Jessica could feel the tension in the air. She wasn't sure if it was just in her own heart or if others could sense it too, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The grand celebration that had started out as the most important day of her life now felt like a turning point. She knew she needed to make things right with Mrs. Eliza, but that wasn't going to be easy. Her gaze flickered toward Daniel's mother, who was quietly finishing her duties in the back of the hall. Mrs. Eliza was still cleaning, just as she had been all day, but there was a quiet dignity in the way she worked. Jessica's eyes filled with regret. How had she allowed herself to think so little of this woman? The wedding was nearing its end, and guests were starting to leave, but Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to be done. She had wronged Mrs. Eliza in front of so many people, and now all she could think about was how to make amends. She walked toward Daniel, who was talking to some of his friends. As soon as he saw her approach, he smiled. "Everything okay?" he asked softly. Jessica hesitated, but then she took a deep breath. "I need to apologize to your mother," she said. "I didn't understand who she really was, and I treated her horribly." Daniel's expression softened. He reached out and took her hand. "I'm glad you see that now," he said quietly. "I know it was a lot to take in, but she's been my whole world. She gave up everything for me, and I'll always be grateful for that." Jessica nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of her mistakes. She felt a deep sense of shame, but also a desire to make things right. "I'll go talk to her," Jessica said. "I owe her that much." Daniel smiled, giving her a supportive nod. "I know you can make it right, Jessica." Jessica found Mrs. Eliza standing by the door, preparing to leave. She walked up to her slowly, unsure of what to say. Mrs. Eliza turned as she heard Jessica's footsteps, and for a moment, the two women simply looked at each other. "I'm so sorry," Jessica said, her voice quiet but sincere. "I treated you horribly today. I was rude, and I didn't see who you really were. You're not just a janitor. You're Daniel's mother, and you've worked so hard for everything. I had no right to treat you the way I did." Mrs. Eliza looked at Jessica for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. "It's not easy to admit when we've been wrong, Jessica, but the fact that you're saying this now means something." Jessica felt a knot in her throat. "I'm sorry. I've learned a lot today. I'll work to be better. I promise." Mrs. Eliza smiled gently. "It's not about promises, dear. It's about actions. Just remember that." Jessica nodded, tears threatening to well up in her eyes. "I'll show you. I'll show Daniel. I'll show everyone." As Mrs. Eliza turned to leave, she paused and placed a hand on Jessica's shoulder. "I believe you, Jessica. You've taken the first step." Jessica stood there, feeling a sense of relief. She hadn't expected things to be perfect, but in that moment, she realized that she could start over, that she could change. As the night drew to a close, Jessica and Daniel stood together, watching the last of their guests leave. Jessica looked up at him, her eyes filled with determination. "I want to do better, Daniel," she said softly. "I don't want to be the person I was before. I want to be the person you deserve." Daniel smiled, his eyes full of warmth. "I know you will, Jessica, and I'll be right here, with you." The wedding was over, but it felt like the beginning of something much more important. Jessica had a long road ahead of her, but for the first time, she felt ready to walk it. The next morning, after the wedding had ended and the last guests had left, Jessica found herself sitting in a quiet corner of the house, her thoughts swirling. The night had been full of surprises, both painful and eye-opening. The wedding that had once felt like the most important event of her life now seemed like a distant memory compared to the lessons she had learned that day. She had spent so many years focusing on the wrong things, the shiny, glittering parts of life that people admired. The wealth, the appearance, the perfection. But now she realized that none of that mattered. What truly mattered was love, respect, and understanding. Her eyes wandered to the window, where sunlight streamed through, casting a warm glow over the room. She thought about Mrs. Eliza again, the woman who had given up so much for her son, the woman who had worked tirelessly to raise him with love and care, never once asking for recognition or praise. She had been so quick to judge Mrs. Eliza because of her job, her clothes, and the fact that she didn't live in a mansion like Jessica did. But now, Jessica understood. Mrs. Eliza was a person who had earned every bit of respect she received, and Jessica had been blind to it. A soft knock on the door interrupted Jessica's thoughts. She looked up to see Daniel standing there, a warm smile on his face. "Hey, you okay?" he asked gently, stepping into the room. Jessica nodded, though there was still a lingering sadness in her eyes. "I'm okay," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about everything. About Mrs. Eliza." Daniel's expression softened. He walked over and sat down next to her. "I know it's been a lot to take in," he said, his voice soothing. "But I'm proud of you, Jessica. I'm proud of how you've started to see things differently." Jessica let out a deep sigh, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I still feel so ashamed, Daniel. I treated your mother like she was nothing, and now I understand just how wrong I was. How could I have been so blind?" Daniel took her hand in his, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "It's not about being perfect. It's about learning and growing. We all make mistakes. The important thing is that you're taking responsibility for yours. That's all I've ever wanted." Jessica smiled faintly, her heart swelling with a mix of guilt and hope. "I want to make it right," she said softly. "I need to apologize to her properly. I need to show her that I respect her." Daniel's eyes sparkled with pride. "I know you can, Jessica. You've already made the first step. Now it's time to show her with your actions." Jessica nodded, her resolve strengthening. "I will. I've learned so much, and I'm not going to forget it. I'll prove it to her, to you, to myself." That afternoon, Jessica went to find Mrs. Eliza. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was the right thing to do. She found the older woman in the garden, picking flowers. Mrs. Eliza looked up as Jessica approached, and for a moment, the two women stood in silence. Finally, Jessica spoke. "Mrs. Eliza, I owe you an apology. A real one. I treated you so badly, and I didn't understand who you are or the sacrifices you've made. You've been so kind, and I've been so wrong." Mrs. Eliza looked at her for a long moment, her expression calm. "It's not easy to admit when we've hurt someone, Jessica, but I can see that you truly mean it. That's all I need to know." Jessica's eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you. I'll show you that I've learned. I'll show you that I respect you, just like I respect Daniel." Mrs. Eliza smiled softly. "I believe you, Jessica. I've seen the change in you already." With that, Jessica finally felt at peace. The apology had been made, and it was time for her to move forward with a new understanding of what truly mattered. As she walked back to the house, her heart felt lighter. She knew that she had a long way to go, but she was ready to be the person she had always wanted to be, the person who saw people for who they truly were, not just for what they had. And as the sun set on the beautiful day, Jessica realized that this was only the beginning of her journey. The days that followed Jessica's apology were filled with quiet reflection and small, meaningful changes. She had been determined to be a better person, not just for Daniel, but for herself. She had spent so much time chasing perfection and wealth that she had lost sight of what really mattered: love, kindness, and respect. Now she was learning how to see the world through a different lens. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow across the house, Jessica sat on the porch with Daniel. The air was warm, and the evening was peaceful. They had been talking about their future, about the life they wanted to build together. It was a future that no longer focused on grand weddings or lavish things. Instead, it was a future built on understanding, hard work, and the love they shared. "I never thought I'd see you like this," Daniel said, his voice filled with warmth. "You've changed, Jessica, and I can see how much you've grown." Jessica smiled softly, looking out at the garden where Mrs. Eliza had been planting flowers. "I've changed because of you, and because of your mother." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I've realized that the things I thought mattered before, they don't matter at all. I've learned that it's not about the money, or the status, or the perfect wedding. It's about the people we care for, the ones who work hard every day and give everything they have." Daniel reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm so proud of you, Jessica. I always knew you had the strength to be better. It's not easy to change, but you've done it. And I can see that you're finally becoming the person you were always meant to be." Jessica's eyes glistened with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of understanding. "I want to show your mother how much I respect her. I want to show her that I'm not the person I was before. I want to prove that I've learned." Daniel nodded, his eyes shining with pride. "I know you will. I can see the sincerity in your heart, and that's what matters most." The following week, Jessica made a point to spend more time with Mrs. Eliza. They worked together in the garden, planting flowers and talking about life. Jessica found herself asking questions she had never thought to ask before, about Mrs. Eliza's life, about the challenges she had faced, and about the sacrifices she had made for her son. Mrs. Eliza spoke softly, but with great wisdom. She told Jessica about the hardships she had endured, about the years of working long hours to provide for Daniel, and about the love she had for him. "It hasn't always been easy," Mrs. Eliza said, "but the most important thing is that Daniel grew up knowing that love is more important than anything else. He always knew that no matter what happened, we had each other." Jessica listened, her heart swelling with admiration. "I never understood how much you gave, how much you sacrificed," she said quietly. "But I see it now. And I'm so sorry for the way I treated you before." Mrs. Eliza smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. "You've apologized, Jessica, and I believe you've truly changed. That's all that matters." As the weeks went by, Jessica and Mrs. Eliza continued to grow closer. They spent more time together, learning from one another. Jessica knew she still had a long way to go, but she also knew that she was on the right path. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Daniel joined them. "You two seem like you've become fast friends," he said with a smile. Jessica smiled back, her heart full. "I've learned so much from your mother, Daniel, and I'm grateful for every moment we've shared." Daniel's eyes softened with love and pride. "I knew you'd come to understand," he said. "And I'm so glad you did." As the three of them sat together, watching the stars appear in the night sky, Jessica felt at peace. She had learned the most important lessons of all, the value of love, respect, and the bonds that tie us together. And for the first time, she felt ready to embrace the future with an open heart. This was just the beginning.